Good morning again, and I welcome you back to the basement studio. We are continuing in our journey through the Gospel of John, and today I anticipate that we will be completing our comments on John chapter 2, and we may get into some of the introductory material for John chapter 3. But there are a few things that I'd like for us to catch up on from last week. And then amplify those before we move further, because I think there are a few very important points to be made. I do want to mention one thing before we get into the content of the class, and that is yesterday I broke my glasses. So I'm dealing with an old pair of glasses this morning, and if it looks like I'm frowning or squinting at you, it's not because I dislike you or because I'm angry. It's simply that I'm struggling to see anything right now, and these glasses are probably going to go on and off several times before this class is over, and I'll try to do my best to not let that interfere with the class as we move forward. But recall what we're looking at in the last half of chapter 2 of John here is the incident when Jesus clears the temple, and this is the first occasion of Jesus clearing the temple. And it's recorded early in his ministry in the Gospel of John. We talked about the processes and the things that were involved when Jesus did that activity, but then we talked about the reactions, and specifically we began with the reaction of the Jewish establishment. And they, of course, challenged Jesus' authority to take such action. And Jesus had replied to them with prophetic words that must have been extremely confusing when he said, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it up again in 3 days." And of course what Jesus was talking about was the fact that these very same Jewish leaders would condemn him to death 2 to 3 years down the road in the future, and then Jesus would come back to life 3 days later. But those who were present at the time didn't have a clue what Jesus was talking about, because they were of course focusing in on the physical temple. And last week we took some time to describe what an incredible structure this temple and the grounds that surrounded the temple, what an incredible architectural and engineering feat that was, especially when you consider that those things were being built and planned and then built and developed all the way back in the first century. So that was really quite remarkable. But anyhow, what we were concluding as we reached the tail end of chapter 2 was we noticed that most of the reactions to Jesus that had been described thus far fell into two groups. There were the reactions of the Jews, which frankly was opposition to Jesus. And of course this didn't refer to all Jews, but it referred to those Jews who were part of the religious establishment. And then there was the second group of those that have been described in the book so far, and those who were becoming his disciples. And so those who were accepting Jesus as God's Son and as being the Messiah that they had been looking for centuries. But at the end of this chapter, we see, and we read it last week, but I want to reread it again, we see the emergence of a third group. And this is the group that is somewhere in the middle. And they possess what we are going to call something called miracle faith. And here we are, we're going to just reread this briefly again. This is John chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. So they did come to a point of faith or understanding that Jesus had special gifts and special powers. And how could you not come to that conclusion when you saw what he was doing? They were watching the miracles. And we don't have the specific miracles recorded here, but we assume that most of those were miracles of healings, okay? But then we continue on in verse 24, after it says that many who were watching believed in his name, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. And what we gather from those verses is even though these people had developed a superficial faith of some sort, it was not a faith that Jesus could rely on. It was not a faith that Jesus could trust. And so there was still some room to grow, and there was some necessary growth on the parts of these people. But that's this middle position, and we're going to call it miracle faith. This is a faith that enjoys being entertained by watching miracles, but it doesn't particularly like being challenged, and it won't necessarily hold up when it's challenged. It's a faith that you might invest some time and even some energy to go see the things that are going on, or even experience the things that are going on, but it's not going to bring out a heart of sacrifice. This middle ground of faith is not really fully invested. And so you might commit some time, some energy, but it's certainly not going to bring out sacrifice. It's a faith that will hold up when things are going well, but it will fall apart during periods of stress or difficulty. That's this middle ground regarding faith. It's a faith of curiosity rather than commitment. And you can see the difference there, that it's one thing to be curious about Jesus. It's a very different thing to be committed to Jesus. It's a faith that remains immature and fails to grow roots and deepen over time. And so by now you can see that what I'm describing here in these three different types of faith are not relevant only to first century Palestine and to the second chapter of John. These are concepts, these are things that we deal with every day of our life as well, and it applies to us. Most of us find ourselves in this position from time to time. We all walk into a faith journey, and the faith journey should look something like this, where we start out maybe not opposed to Jesus, but at least not aligned with Jesus. We come to a point of initial faith, and we understand some basic principles about Jesus, but it's sometime later that we become and develop a disciple's faith. Okay? So think about that process of growing in faith, because that's what we're going to talk about for most of the rest of this class, the process of growth in faith that we all find ourselves in. We start in a faith journey for a lot of different reasons. And if you think back to what it was that captivated you to Christ, you should take a minute to identify those things. But for some, it's a role model. That might be a parent. It might be someone who, I know of people who they got a ride to church with somebody consistently. And so, those role models helped form those initial moments, those initial acquaintances with Christ. And those are the things that cause that faith to begin to germinate. So a role model is a common reason for many of us to have bought into Christianity. Some of us enter into faith because of an acute life crisis. There might be a situation that arises where there are great needs in our life, and that drives us to the point that we seek answers for that acute question and that acute need. Sometimes it's just a spur-of-the-moment decision. And you may experience a life-changing experience, like a significant convicting lesson. You think about the gospel meetings of old and how the powerful preaching would convict some, okay? Or you may go to an eye-opening concert or something along those lines, where all of a sudden you see something that you never saw before. You have this spur-of-the-moment experience, and you realize this is the direction that I'm interested in going. But that's not necessarily the depth of faith that you're going to eventually need. Okay, but there are others, and these are, I think, few and far between, but there are some who enter into their faith journey after they have gone on a long journey of inquiry. And what I'm talking about here are people like C.S. Lewis, or somebody like John Clayton. Now these names you may recognize, you may not. Or Lee Strobel. Of course, C.S. Lewis was a tremendous theologian. John Clayton is an evidentiary science teacher who worked in the Smithsonian Institute. And then Lee Strobel is a journalist. All three of these people set out to disprove Christ and to disprove the principles that are revealed in this biblical book. But all three of them, through this long, hard work process, they uncovered truths in Scripture and eventually became convicted. So I don't think many of us can claim to be that intellectually honest in our pursuit of Christ, but nonetheless, there are some who do that, and that's how they end up at this position of initial faith. But the reality is that faith comes in varieties and degrees, and it's a growth process with ups and downs. You're not just going to steadily go from point A to point C. There's going to be a lot of detours along the way, and there's going to be a lot of ups and downs. The challenge for us is to make this journey. The challenge for us is to grow beyond that initial superficial level into something that is truly sustaining for the rest of our lives. And I'm reminded of Psalm chapter 1. I wasn't planning to go here, but this seems pertinent. I'm reminded of Psalm chapter 1 because it describes what faith looks like when it becomes mature. It said, "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers or mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." And here it is. "He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers." And that's the picture of this deep, abiding, nourishing faith. It's a picture of strength. It's a picture of longevity. It's a picture of health and life and wisdom. And that's the picture that we are all aiming for. So we want to develop this faith that sustains life and is not limited to those initial things that initially drew us into Christ, but that will apply for everything in the rest of our lives. Let me give you an example here. Many years ago, someone told me this principle, and it's not absolute truth, but there's a lot of truth in it. And what he said was, what you win them with, or what you convert somebody to, is what you win. What you convert somebody with is what you win them to. All right, let me say it again. What you win somebody with is what you win them to. And as I reflect on this over the years, I think of a lot of different reasons that people have come to Christ. And some of them are very frivolous, unfortunately. I think back to when I was a kid and some of the ways that I was enticed to come to VBS. And it was sometimes things like you'll get a pet fish, or if you come to VBS, the minister at the end of the week, if we get past a certain goal, he'll shave his head, or he'll stand on his head. Those kind of things. Well, the question is, what kind of faith do those activities really produce? And what happens when the carnival ends? Because the carnival will end. And has that created then enough faith to go on past that? Well, you see what I'm driving at here, that what one wins, what we are one with is what we are one to. If you're drawn in because of the show, then that's going to be what is required to keep you unless you grow roots. All right? Sometimes people are drawn in by a special experience. Again, we think of either a special guest speaker, a special concert, some special thing that gives us a momentary high, and lo and behold, there's a conviction that occurs there. But you can't sustain that degree of excitement over the long run. You can't have a guest speaker every week, or that will get old too. And so, no matter what we do here, we can't maintain that same level of just emotional enthusiasm. I think of this when I think of Winterfest. and what our kids enjoy when they go to an environment like that. And it's a great capturing environment, but it's not an environment that can be sustained. And there has to be something else to backfill. And indeed, like it's like that tree planted by the waters. Those roots have to grow deep. They have to develop on their own. Sometimes people are converted by a specific and particular ministry. It might be a children's program or a children's outreach or a children's class. It could be a specific teacher. It could be a community outreach. But you know what? Over time, ministries all change. They begin to look different. Children's programs change. Community outreaches change. Speakers change. Teachers change. And so what is necessary for long-term faith is to use those initial experiences to get your feet wet, but then you've got to dive into the pool and swim, okay? And that's the challenge that we face. So here's the question that we need to look at today. How do we grow faith? How does faith grow? And there's a simple scripture that I think gives us the answer. Romans 10:17. Most of you should be able to recite this, but it tells us that there are two requirements for the growing of faith. It simply says, faith comes by hearing. That's the what. I'm sorry, that's the how. And hearing comes from the Word of God or the Word of Christ. There is a little bit of discrepancy in some of the translations and some of the early texts that we're not going to go into today. But this is the answer. The Word of Christ is the what? Okay? Romans 10:17 tells us that faith is based on these two premises. Number one, hearing. And this is not just simply hearing it with your ears. Remember how many times in his ministry Jesus said, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." That tells us that this is not something that happens accidentally or unintentionally. It's something that requires work. It requires your effort. It requires you to sit down and take something and dissect it and figure out, is this true? Is this believable? Is this something I will commit to? Is this something that can change my life? Or am I just simply going to discard it? And so the challenge is not just hearing it in a superficial way, but it's the challenge of studying it and figuring it out as far as what this means for my life. And how do I apply it then to what I will do tomorrow? How will I do differently tomorrow from what I did today? Okay? And then what do we hear? Well, of course, that's the Word of Christ. And there is no substitute for God's Word in the process of faith development. Now, it would be nice if there were. It would be nice if there were an easier way, but there isn't. There is no substitute for God's Word. We have to listen to it. We have to study it. And let me throw one more thing in here. We have to watch it. And by watching it, I mean watch it as it's lived out in the lives of those around us, because that gives us a special view of the application of Scripture. And as we can look at others who are farther along in this faith journey than we are, we can see what faith brings to their life and how they maintain and grow and deepen that faith in their life and how they share that faith. Those are the things that we need to be focused on as we focus on the Word of Christ. You remember, there's an old saying, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. And there's a lot of teaching and a lot of learning that can go on by looking at how Scripture should be applied in the lives of mature believers. There's great gain in that. So this growth process is not accidental. It's not unintentional. It requires great self-discipline. And the discipline is very simply to hear the Word of God, and number two, to be sure that it's the Word of God. Now, hearing God's Word, though, is not easy in an information age. There is so much noise going on around us, even when you think you're looking at spiritual things. And this is an important part of the planning. An important part of the planning for your growth is checking your sources. Who are you really trusting? Who has your ear? Who do you listen to when it comes to spiritual development, when it comes to spiritual growth, when it comes to things I need to be doing in my life? Who has your ear? You know that for many years I taught medical students and medical residents about what it meant to be a practicing physician. And the area of expertise that I developed over that time was that of assimilating and understanding medical information. And one point I would make is that when I was teaching these residents, I talked to them about the fact that medical education changes. And in its initial days, the process of learning medicine requires, it's much like, the analogy that I would use is much like stocking a grocery store. When you first open a grocery store, you have to just get 85 boxes of macaroni, and you have to stock the whole place. So you've got to get all of this material, and you've just got to throw it on the wall. You have to get all this stuff in. Well, that's the process of the early phases of medical education. That's what you do in medical school. You spend hour after hour learning fact after fact after fact after fact. But you know what? Once a grocery store opens, those information needs change. And now they have to watch what's happening to my inventory over there in the bean shelves, and how many have they bought, and how many more do I need to replace those? So you've got to watch what's going out of the store, what do I need to bring into the store. Well, this, the same is true for the process of medical education. You've got to watch what's changing in medicine, and believe me, it changes fast. It's been estimated that every 18 months the knowledge base of modern medicine doubles. So that's quite a bit of rapid change, and you've got to be ready for that. But it requires a whole different education process than those first steps. And the same is true, I would hold, in spiritual education. That what we learn when we are coming to Christ is very different from what we need to learn in order to grow deep in Christ. Let me say that one more time. What we need to know to come to Christ is very different from what we need to know in order to grow deep in Christ. Okay? All right, so in medical information gathering, the best source, the primary source for information, is we try to keep up and we try to educate ourselves and we try to be competent in all the areas of medicine which we are practicing. The best source for that information is research and reading the research journals. Okay, but that's hard work. There's nothing easy about it, and you've got to learn special techniques to figure out how to read the literature. There are some things that are much easier. And these are things like listening to the drug reps that knock on your door and want 2 minutes of your time every lunch hour. You know what I discovered during my time in medicine is that's a dangerous source of information, because they have different agendas. Their agenda is strictly to identify your prescribing patterns and change them. But that's not really what my goal is. My goal is to figure out what is useful for different disease conditions that are affecting my patients, all right? And so using those secondary sources of information, while they are very easy for me as a practicing physician, they can be dangerous. The same is true in you and me with our spiritual education. We can turn to dangerous sources, all right? What are you listening to? Who has your ear when it comes to things of God? Is it primarily music? Is it primarily social media posts? Is it primarily personal witnessing or testimony from individuals? Is it even teachers. And we have to be careful about the teachers we choose and what we listen to when we're listening to teachers. I'm even going to tell you, you should be challenging me. Okay? And everything that we say needs verification. All of these sources can only be secondary sources of information. I've heard it said that many of the younger generation of Christians in the United States particularly know more theology from Christian bands than they do from Scripture. It's a dangerous place. It's a dangerous place we find ourselves in. The only primary, before we talk about the primary sources, I want to talk about one other group of secondary sources for us in Christian development and growth. And this is a really hard one. You thought it was tough already. This one's even harder. Another secondary source that is dangerous for us, or can be dangerous for us, are voices from the past. And that danger is really profound because those voices from the past can't be questioned. Those can include people like our parents. It can include our Christian role models that were instrumental in our initial coming to Christ. It can be those spiritual mentors that have helped us develop over the years. It can be the guidelines and the rules that we learned growing up and as we were experiencing our religious upbringing. Those things still are only secondary sources. You know what the danger is in those things? We remember the conclusions that were shared with us or taught to us. We remember the conclusions, but we don't usually remember the context. We don't remember the context, and we don't remember the reasoning for those conclusions. And so that's the danger, is we tend to accept our understanding of the conclusions without really understanding the application, the proper application of those conclusions. So we have to be really, really careful with secondary sources of information. That's what I'm saying. Whether it's a teacher, whether it's a voice from the past, whether it's your Facebook account and what you look at and see on there, even stuff that sounds good and sounds attractive, here's the primary source and here's the fundamental question. There are only two places that serve as primary sources of information: the Scriptures and the Holy Spirit. Those are the only two primary sources from which we can gain insight into God and into Jesus Christ. This faith journey is one that is a great challenge for us. But I want to show one more thing to you here as well before we leave this alone. Answer this question for me. What's the opposite of faith? Well, surprisingly, it's not really disbelief. Instead, the opposite of faith is doubt. And what that's telling us is that faith, when it matures, turns into trust. Faith is an understanding, but trust is a commitment. Okay? Do you see the difference? That's what happens when one is growing in faith. The opposite of faith is not disbelief, but it's doubt or uncertainty. A mature faith is all about confidence. A mature faith requires enough confidence then to act according to those faith-held beliefs. Doubt will cause one to waver and sway and eventually quit. And that's the type of faith that Jesus is unable to rely on. That's the type of faith that we have identified here as miracle faith. That's the type of faith that won't hold on. So, where are you? Where am I in our faith journeys? Are we down here where we fully trust? Is your faith growing or is it shrinking? The whole point of John's gospel, John 20, verse 31, is to grow in faith. Remember, these things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So here's the final question, and we're going to hold this question up as we go through the entire book. How does this incident in the temple help us develop faith and ultimately become more trusting? Well, I'm going to suggest there are three things that occur here that are each very important. Number one, John records information for us that tells us Jesus is on our side. Okay? Remember that we learned that the common people in Jerusalem for that Passover were facing a great injustice and an abuse of power. Jesus came into that situation and took up their cause, and he inserted himself into the hierarchy of those. Well, he didn't insert himself into the hierarchy, he inserted himself over the hierarchy of those who were controlling the temple processes and the temple practices. And in so doing, he took the role of being the son over his father's house. And that is the same assurance that we can know and we can experience. This is very much like what the disciples experienced back in Cana when they saw Jesus save the day in a private setting. But that had to be tremendously reassuring to them and allowed them to place their trust in him. Number two, what John does in this is he describes Jesus giving a prophetic message. The message was to the leaders in the temple. His message was, if you destroy this temple, as you're going to do, I will raise it in 3 days. And even his disciples did not understand that until later. But John tells us that his disciples, looking back, saw the fulfillment of that prophetic message. And so what he's telling us is that Jesus said this thing either 2 or 3 years before it took place, and then it took place exactly as he predicted. Okay? It proved to be entirely true. And you can rest assured that when Jesus makes other promises, for example, in chapter 14 and 15, when he's in his farewell discourse, and he says, believe God, you believe in me, Let's get it and read it. Trust in God, trust also in me. That's Jesus' admonition for us. And John is saying we can believe this stuff because when Jesus said it, it took place, even though nobody else understood it. Okay? And the third thing that we see Jesus saying in this situation was that after the miracles were done and those people began to come to faith, it's that faith is a journey. That initial faith wasn't enough. It had to grow. But what John is doing, as he has done already in this book, is he's inviting us to come alongside. Get involved here. And wherever you're at on this faith journey, get involved and make it head in the right direction. Make it head towards a greater understanding, a greater meaning in your life, a greater trust. And that's ultimately what we're looking for. This incident about the temple and the events immediately following it should bolster our confidence in Jesus, because we should be reassured that he cares about us. We should listen to his message because it will come true. And we should see that no matter where we're at on that faith journey, it is a journey, and we've all got work to do. Now, we're not going to go into it in great detail, but next we're going to start into chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we're going to learn of a man named Nicodemus. And Nicodemus, it's interesting, he takes the position of this man being on a faith journey. And Jesus is going to teach him, and he's going to tell him how to figure out the rest of the path, how to figure out the rest of the journey. Jesus is going to give him those kind of answers in chapter 3. So I look forward to seeing you next week as we learn of Jesus and Nicodemus and the great faith journey that Nicodemus was on, and what Jesus had to say, both to challenge him and to encourage him. So I hope you're challenged by what we've said today, but I hope you're also encouraged. And God bless you. Don't forget, God is good all the time, and I'll see you next week.